Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Panchakalpatarubhyascha, Kripasindubhya evacha, Haridanam Pavanebhyo, Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Hare Krishna, I'm Kurma, and this is part 2 of our two-part series in the narration of the history of the Melbourne Temple. In our first part, which you may have heard, I described the years before the Melbourne Temple was located, the early history of Melbourne Temple, and Prabhupada's negotiation plans to purchase this wonderful property. And now, part 2 of the story describes the opening of the temple on this auspicious day, May 1975. As I said last time, you can read all about it if you got this original copy of The Great Transcendental Adventure, or you might have seen, or you might have purchased this hefty volume, which is full of nectar, Prabhupada nectar, Australian Prabhupada nectar, which you should read, you must read if you want to absorb yourself in Prabhupada's mercy and recall the great sacrifices that the previous devotees here in Australia have performed. There they are behind me, the glorious devotees. As I said last time, I'm up there, and I can't point them all out to you at this stage, but you can find this picture on my Facebook page, and you will note the names also. Some of these devotees have passed on. Some of these devotees are still living, but they're all in their 70s. I'd like to just mention this Mataji here, Ragat Mika. That's her little daughter. That, just to give you an idea, that daughter is now a grandmother. Time and tide waits for no man. So this is excerpted. Today's talk is excerpted from chapter 11 of my book, which is entitled Such a Nice Temple. That's Prabhupada's words. He described that the Melbourne Temple was such a nice place. And it certainly is. I cannot be there with you today, but I'm there in spirit. So I'll give you some history, for a start, of the Melbourne Temple itself, before it became the Melbourne Temple. I did this research for my book, and as you might have gathered, it's not a new building. It is an old building, and it is an historic building, especially we're talking about Prabhupada House. Prabhupada House, which the picture of which is behind me here. The land for this property was purchased from the Crown in 1875 by a British judge, Thomas Abercrombie Mowat. He had spared no expense. He had plenty of money, and he shipped in Italian artisans and plasterers from Italy, and he built this beautiful home. At this time, 1875, even though you may, even though, of course, it is fully developed at this stage, but at that time, it was just sand dunes, rolling sand dunes, all the way from St Kilda to Port Melbourne. And it resembled a miniature Sahara desert. It was actually a tourist spot at the time for people to visit. It was like a desert. The judge's mansion, this building behind me, was the only building for miles. And it was built on a military road, which was known as Emerald Hill Beach. The area was known as Emerald Hill Beach, and it commanded a beautiful view of the ocean. The local people called this building Mowat's Folly. They considered that since it was built on sand, it would sink into the sand after some time, which, of course, it didn't. The judge lived there. He had stables and all sorts of facilities there. And as I said, the magnificent sandstone building This is a sandstone building. It didn't sink into the sand dunes, but it survived the judge and his family. After Judge Mowat passed away, the imposing building behind me then became the property of a famous manufacturer of irrigational windmills named James Alston. And by the turn of the century, that is the turn of the 20th century, this newly constructed beach road was in place. This was called Beaconsfield Parade. And by then, Beaconsfield Parade was a viable access to the area. And by then, Danks Street also existed. After Mr. Alston passed away, his widow bequeathed both of these buildings, Prabhupada House and this temple building, bequeathed them to the Catholic Church, who then transformed buildings into Our Lady of Mount Carmel boys' school. This was the boom of the Catholic Church, and they were constructing and developing many buildings at the time. The newly added brick buildings, that is the temple room building, became classrooms, and Mont Alto House, which was the original name for Prabhupada House, became the home of the priests, and it was their chapel. So Mont Alto House was an excellent example of residential Victorian Italianate architecture. This was an extravagant style which had grown in popularity at the time. It was a symbol of prosperity, and it had all the beautiful features, as you can see here, a little bit, of course, as you're fully aware of, these triple arches, pronounced bay facade, corniced eaves, gables, upper veranda, ornate balustrade, tall circular columns, Corinthian capitals, lofty ceilings, elaborate rosettes, deep handcrafted cornices. These beautiful features, of course, have been preserved. Let's shed some more light. So one day, well, I'll get back to that. Let me continue. Prabhupada House had achieved historical prominence, and its imposing architectural features warranted the National Trust of Australia to grant it historical building status. And because of this historical building status, the property developers were unable to use this property, and it became Krishna's property. So by the time Srila Prabhupada was in Perth, as I mentioned in the last recording, Srila Prabhupada was staying for 10 days in Perth while the construction and development of the Melbourne Temple was reaching its climax. The devotees had fully restored the original architectural features within and without. And the National Trust were very appreciative that we had not desecrated any of the original features. The only things that we had done to change the original features was to put tilak on the face of the Renaissance style ladies' faces that you'll see on the front of the building. And we had placed a golden chakra on the roof, and we had changed the wording of the name of the building from Mont Alto House to Prabhupada House. But apart from that, the building now shone in its original brilliance. Some envious neighbors had some interactions with the devotees in the early days, but authorities in South Melbourne were very happy with what we had done. So for 6 months, the devotees were working very, very hard to bring this temple up to standard before Prabhupada's visit. There were male devotees living on site and laboring very, very hard to reach the deadline, which was, of course, Prabhupada's arrival. They only had 10 more days. So the larger of the two buildings, which was Prabhupada's quarters, was set aside, as I said, for Prabhupada's rooms, offices, and a kitchen. And this building needed particular care. So the devotees spent many months perched on ladders and scaffolds. They practically lived on ladders and scaffolds. They sandblasted the entire building, relocated external plumbing fixtures, replaced old mortar, rotten wood, and repaired all the ropes and weights in every counterweighted sash window. You may have seen, if you had the original volume of my book, what the building looked like when it was purchased. It was certainly not as beautiful as it is today. By the time the Catholic Church had endured many decades of the traversing of young boys in the boys' school, it was certainly pretty much trashed. So 25 rooms in both buildings needed major work. Almost every inch of wall space was filled, sanded, repainted. New panes of glass were fitted. A fully functioning kitchen was installed. Bathrooms were built from scratch. So this brings us to Saturday, 17th of May, 1975. You may calculate that that's one day before 18th of May, 1975, which was the day of the opening of the temple. What happened on that day is that Srila Prabhupada arrived from Perth. We'll turn that down a bit. Right. So when Prabhupada arrived from Perth, in fact, he had an entourage. And these were the first devotees that had accompanied Srila Prabhupada to Western Australia. There was Amoga Prabhu, Jayadharma, Sriman Shrutikirti, who was Prabhupada's servant at the time, Paramahamsa Swami, and Ganesh Das. They were greeted at Melbourne Airport with a huge kirtan and exuberant greeting. This was just the day before Prabhupada opened the temple. While Prabhupada was in Perth, a focal point of the construction was the temple room. This, as I said before, was a previous double science room. The temple room and the deity room were two classrooms with a wall in between. Unrecognizable today, of course. In fact, one day I recall some old schoolboys from the school visited the temple, and they were absolutely gobsmacked, astonished, in fact, at what we have done. Madhavisa Swami actually spared no expense, and he shipped in 3 huge carved marble thrones, which is now the deity altars. They were in pieces, in boxes of little pieces, and we glued them together. They originally had come from Jaipur, and the temple room itself was just a wooden floor. The wooden floor was removed. No, in fact, the wooden floor was not removed, but holes were cut in the wooden floor. Brick piers were built and concrete was poured into the holes. That's the now temple room. We, devotees, had built everything ourselves except the marble floors. We had Italian workers come in to place beautiful, gorgeous marble on the floor, white and pink marble from Greece and Italy. You'll notice the beautiful lotus-shaped inlay in the middle of the temple room. That's green Pakistani onyx. And these beautiful Rajasthani columns were constructed by Vaibhavi Devi Dasi and Bhaskara Prabhu. And these are the archways in the temple and between the temple and the deity room. Vaibhavi Devidasi, empowered by Lord Sri Krishna. These carved lotuses tipped with pink adorned the bases, and each of these was topped with a roaring lion's head relief. All this was there when Prabhupada arrived. The floor was not polished when Prabhupada arrived. There was no time. But after a short time, the marble was polished and it became ecstatically, transcendently effulgent. So Bhaskara Prabhu and his team, the brother of Ram Prasad, who's I think in this picture, but I can't find him at this point. He built beautiful, he arranged for the building and constructed parts of the gates himself. They were cast and established as the formal boundary between the kirtan hall and the temple room. Cast iron doors were built to complete the demarcation. Sparkling chandeliers were hung from the ceiling. These are not the original chandeliers that you see today. There was another set of chandeliers from India. So as the week of Prabhupada's arrival drew near, van loads of devotees arrived from Sydney and Adelaide. The last few days and nights were intense. Devotees recall that they didn't sleep the last few nights, and they hung heavy purple curtains, paintings in the temple room. They wired the chandeliers. They cleaned and prepared Prabhupada's quarters. They tended to hundreds and hundreds of other small tasks in those final hours before Prabhupada's arrival. On the very last morning before Prabhupada's arrival from the airport, Sri Radha Vallabha, Sri Radha and Krishna, Lord Jagannath, Lord Baladev, and Srimati Tulsi, Srimati Subhadra Devi Dasi were placed in a vehicle, and they were driven from the St. Kilda temple, and they were brought to their new home in Danks Street. This was the very last morning before Prabhupada's arrival. And of course, missing at this point in my description were Gaur Nitai. Where did Gaura Nitai come from? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. So Prabhupada arrived at the temple. The sun had set. Both buildings were in darkness. Prabhupada stepped out of the car, and then, as prearranged, someone pressed a switch and all the lights went on, including beautiful colored bulbs which adorned the property. Hundreds of colored bulbs, and Prabhupada placed his hands together and smiled wonderfully. Beaming with pleasure, accompanied by loud kirtan, he entered the front gate, and he was showered with rose petals from the veranda above this picture here. That veranda, ladies showered him with flowers. Prabhupada entered the portico through the door into the opulent entrance hall of this building. The floor glistened with glazed Italian ceramic tiles. The delicate blue and crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling. I presume it's still there at the base of Prabhupada's stairs. That was a gorgeous piece. And he noted all of these things as he entered. The carved cedar handrail and banisters had been freshly polished. Prabhupada looked impressed as he slowly walked up the steep, red carpeted stairs to the upper floor. As Srila Prabhupada paused at the top of the stairs, Nadavisa stepped forward and opened the white door to his room. And he noticed all the beautiful, tasteful refurbishments, large Belgian-style rug. The original rug is still there, very expensive Belgian rug, in the center of the highly polished parquet floor. He noticed all these beautiful features, the glazed, the stained glass windows, the heavy powder blue velvet drapes, they're still there, of course, the matching walls, blue and white, Prabhupada's favorite colors, the ornate antique ebony chaise longue, and he turned to the devotees with a look of humble, childlike innocence, and he said, "Is this all for me?" Prabhupada later spoke with Madhavisa. He said, "This is a very nice house. What is the cost?" And Madhavisa replied, $185,000. Srila Prabhupada, $185,000 would not buy you very much today. So, Sunday, 18th of May, 1975, Inauguration Day. This was the formal inauguration of the new temple and the installation of Gaur-Nitai. As I said, Gaur-Nitai had not been seen by the devotees. They were on the altar, but they were wrapped in cloth, and no one had seen them. This was by February 1975, Prabhupada had already installed Gaur-Nitai deities in 3 other major temples around the world, Caracas, Miami, and Atlanta. And today, they would be installed here in Melbourne. These deities were unique. These were, at the time, the largest deities of Gaur-Nitai, made of Astadatta, 8 metals, ever to be cast in the history of Bengal. Ever. Each deity weighs 270 kilos. It takes 6 men to lift each deity with difficulty. So, after the casting of these deities in Calcutta, they had been buried in sand for many weeks to cool them down, and then they were floated by barge down the Ganges. They were transported to Calcutta, and they were shipped to Melbourne. There were fears that the deities would not arrive in time, but I remember one day a flatbed truck drove in the backyard equipped with a crane and deposited 2 huge wooden crates in the backyard. This was Gaur-Nitai, and they arrived in time. With much effort, we moved the deities, removed them from their crates, and carried them across the courtyard to the deity room, where they were placed and wrapped. They were placed still wrapped, and they were placed still wrapped on the altar until Prabhupada's arrival. So, on the morning of the 18th of May, Prabhupada was ready to come down to the temple. There were some delays. Eventually, by this stage, 4 hours late, there were hundreds and hundreds of guests who had been invited. Excuse me. And all the devotees practically in Australia had come to Melbourne at that time. All the devotees that existed in ISKCON Australia had come to Melbourne. We had also invited neighbours, workmen who had helped with the construction, local dignitaries, the mayor, friends, relatives of the devotees. They all had squeezed in the temple room. Prabhupada was going to personally install the deities. He entered the deity room at this stage. He came down the stairs wearing shiny saffron silk. You may have seen these videos of Prabhupada at the installation day. Hopefully, they have been shown or will be shown at the festival. They were taken by William Hare, who was the celebrated photographer who had photographed many hours of Melbourne footage. So Prabhupada entered the deity room. The doors were still closed. The ecstatic kirtan resounded in the temple room. The deities would be bathed, but of course they wouldn't be lifted into bathing tanks because they weighed 270 kilos each. And so Prabhupada arranged at that time, with his ingenuity, blue towels were placed in front of the altar to catch the Abhishek liquids. And he placed them in a V shape directly in front of the altar. And he noted that some of the items were missing, so he sent devotees. We were running like little rabbits to find missing items, extra bowls and ladles. It was time to start. So then, while the doors were still closed, I was fortunate enough to be in the deity room at this time, along with the other pujaris, and Srila Prabhupada and Madhurvisa Swami. The cloth was removed from the covering of the deities. The deities were astonishingly beautiful. Prabhupada stood palms together, gazing reverentially at the golden bodies of Lord Chaitanya and Lord Nityananda, who were very strongly built with powerful arms, stalwart chests, huge hips, large, broad, and very thin waists, the classic symbol of beauty in the Vedic paradigm. They had huge, large lotus petal eyes, bordered by strikingly dark eyebrows. Their arms were raised, encouraging everyone to chant Hare Krishna, and they smiled beneficently. So the conches blew, the doors opened, the devotees saw the deities for the first time. They gasped in ecstasy. They struck with wonder. They offered their obeisances and danced like mad fellows in the temple room. Devotees were chanting Purusha Shukta, and the proceedings began. As you note in the video, Prabhupada poured ladlefuls of bathing liquid over the head of Lord Nityananda, and a few moments he indicated for Madhurvisa to assist by bathing Lord Chaitanya. The kirtan grew in intensity. Liquids glided down the beautiful forms and touched their lotus feet. Then Prabhupada and Madhurvisa poured warm water for rinsing the deities, and all the while the Abhishek of Gaunitai was recorded for posterity. Then Prabhupada indicated for Madhurvisa to mop up. He stood with a slightly tilted movement of his head that the doors should be closed so the deities could be dressed. As I said, I was very fortunate to be there. Prabhupada asked for kopins. Where is the underwear for the deities? We didn't have any. Someone tore up a piece of satin curtain. That was actually Paramahamsa Swami, which was almost impossible to tear, but we managed it. And we placed some underwear on the bodies of the deity. And then the beautiful clothes that had been purchased in India were offered to Gaunitai. Two pujaris were there, Dwaipayana and myself, Kurmadas. And we dressed the deities in beautiful, bright-colored dhotis covered with gota and silk and all sorts of jewelry. And then we placed golden ornaments on the Lord's chest, and we placed crowns on their head. Dwaipayana reached to offer tulsi leaves. Meanwhile, Srila Prabhupada was sitting in the corner next to Lord Nityananda on his chadar, and he was right next to us, watching everything we did. While Dwaipayana reached to offer tulsi leaves and flowers on the huge, beautiful lotus feet of Lord Nityananda, I dressed Lord Chaitanya. Prabhupada leaned over and he said, pointing, place them between the feet. So the tulsi leaves should be placed between the feet of Gaunitai. The cooks had spent many days preparing the feast. The feast was brought in. Prabhupada personally bowed down, and the other pujaris also bowed and rang bells. Then after the offering, the kirtan, the arati took place. Prabhupada stood and he personally offered the arati ceremony to Gaunitai, and two other pujaris, I can't remember who they were, not myself, performed arati for Radha Vallabha and Jagannath, Baladev and Subhadra. They were watching Srila Prabhupada out of the corner of their eyes. This was the first time that a three-man arati took place, and they noted Prabhupada's beautiful, graceful, fluid movements, and ecstatically the temple erupted in beautiful kirtan, as I said. Then Prabhupada stepped out of the deity room and he chanted the auspicious Mangala-charana prayers. When he stepped out of the deity room, he went to the back of the temple where there was a fire sacrifice already set up, and he intoned the Mangala-charana, glorifying the previous spiritual masters, the Supreme Lord and his associates. Grains were distributed. he chanted Svaha with every successive oblation of ghee. Guests and devotees threw their grains into the fire, and he reached into the microphone and chanted the auspicious concluding invocations. Melbourne Radha Krishna Mandir Ki Jai. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu Avirbhava Titi Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. Thank you very much. And then Prabhupada rose and left for his quarters. The fire sacrifice was going to be concluded by other devotees, and he was going to offer the beads at another day for the initiations. Prabhupada was very pleased with the day. Madhavisa recalls in his memoirs, it was a glorious day. It was the culmination of everyone's hard labor and of everything that had ever gone on in the Australian Yatra since those early days. This was a record in the history of Australian ISKCON. It was the first temple that we actually owned and not rented. Almost every devotee from the entire zone was there. The largest number of devotees that had ever come to a temple at any one time were there. The most beautiful deities, the most gorgeous temple, and of course, Srila Prabhupada was there. It was a shining success. Prabhupada was very happy with the sincere work, and he later sent a letter saying, from the photo, it appears, because we sent him a photo after the marble had been polished, everything appears very nice, he said. I'm very glad. In Melbourne, Australia, who dreamt that there would be such a nice temple, Radha Krishna, and that local men would be worshipping? And still, anyone who is sincerely serving, he will get inspiration how to do it very nicely. Krishna is there in his heart. As a child, he said, when I was going to the neighboring Malik temple, I was thinking then, when will I have such a nice deity to worship? Now Krishna is so kind that I am establishing so many nice temples all over the world. All temples in Melbourne, London, Paris, Bombay are all very nice. Everything is very bright and brilliant. The deity is proof. Excuse me. The deity is proof of the sincere service. So, excuse me. So I thank you for listening. Prabhupada wanted to see that these temples be maintained very nicely. And of course, they are, including the beautiful Melbourne Temple. Thank you very much. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.